A bunch of lunatics in North Korea is making noises. They're closing down a very nice plant that was between them and South Korea. And finally, after all the bellicose talk, China has decided to weigh in and saying destabilizing the neighborhood isn't cool.
That's exactly right. And another group that's speaking out is the persecuted Christians of North Korea. Gary Lane has the story.
The two major military powers are hoping to limit the possibility of military conflict on the Korean peninsula. In a harsh warning to North Korea, China's new president said no country in Asia should be allowed to throw the region and even the whole world into chaos for selfish gain. And a number of leaders in Washington are also warning North Korea against acting militarily. Senator Lindsey Graham says, unlike in the past, this time South Korea would react with a proportional response.
If there were a South Korean naval vessel sunk this year, anytime soon, or shelling of a South Korean island by North Korea, I think the new president of South Korea would be compelled to act. I think the North Koreans are overplaying their hands.
Appearing on NBC's Meet the Press, former United Nations Ambassador Bill Richardson says the goal should not be just to calm North Korea down.
The goal has to be, how do we get North Korea back to the negotiating table on nuclear proliferation, on denuclearization?
Meanwhile, a possible conflict could escalate the suffering of the North Korean population. The tiny Christian community, perhaps as few as 100,000 in a nation of 25 million, are requesting prayer. They're possibly the most persecuted in the world. They're forced to live their lives as secret believers, and if discovered, they're sent to labor camps or killed for their faith. At least 30,000 are imprisoned.
They asked specifically for peace in that region and that the Lord may come into the heart of Kim Jong-un and also give wisdom to our officials in the United States and China and South Korea in the important decisions that they have to make.
Gary Lane, CBN News.
I was reading today that the aunt of this young man seems to be the real power behind the throne. She is a little lady who is dominating the situation, but whoever is doing it, and you wonder what they're trying to accomplish, because if they actually engage in military activity, I think the nations of the earth are going to slap them down. It's long, long overdue. Well, here in America, we're saddened at the news of Rick Warren's son, who committed suicide, and Christians are mourning with him over this tragic loss. Lee Webb has that story.
That's right, Pat. Rick Warren and his family have asked for prayers following the suicide death of their son, and Christians have been sending messages of love and support for the family. Charlene Israel has the story.
Pastor Rick Warren gave thanks for the support he and his wife Kay have received following the suicide of their 27-year-old son. Warren tweeted to his nearly 1 million followers, "Kay and I are overwhelmed by your love, prayers, and kind words. You are all encouraging our broken hearts." Matthew Warren took his life at his Mission Viejo home in what his family says was a momentary wave of despair. In a heartbreaking memo to his 20,000-member Saddleback Church, the author of the best-selling Purpose-Driven Life said his son ended his life after a lifelong battle with mental illness. Church members remember Matthew as a kind and gentle soul.
He was a sweet, talented, creative, brilliant young man.
Still, Warren said his son fought a lonely battle with depression. But only those closest knew that he struggled from birth with mental illness, dark holes of depression, and even suicidal thoughts. In spite of America's best doctors, meds, counselors, and prayers for healing, the torture of mental illness never subsided, said Warren. He marveled at his son's courage to keep on living in his darkest moments despite his pain. I'll never forget how many years ago, after another approach had failed to give relief, Matthew said, "Dad, I know I'm going to heaven. Why can't I just die and end this pain?" Millions of Americans face a similar fight. The Centers for Disease Control estimates that around 3.4% of Americans suffer from depression, and roughly 40,000 people commit suicide every year in the United States. Meanwhile, Pastor Warren is asking for prayers and support for him and his family. a role reversal for the man who has led so many others through dark times. Evangelist and pastor Greg Laurie, whose son was killed in a car accident in 2008, offered his support to the family. At times like these, there really are no words, but there is the Word. There is no manual, but there is Emmanuel. God is with us. I know the Lord will be there for all of the Warren family and Saddleback Church as they grieve together. Looking forward to that day when God will restore all things. Charlene Israel, CBN News.
Former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher has died from a stroke at the age of 87. She was the youngest woman to be elected to the British Parliament at 34, and she became Britain's first female Prime Minister in 1979. She led the Conservative Party into power, campaigning on free markets and a fierce opposition to communism. She and Ronald Reagan, of course, allied to bring an end to the Cold War in the 1980s. Thatcher was ousted, though, in 1990 after a political struggle in her party, but she will always be remembered as the Iron Lady. Pat?
Well, I think she probably was the most admired foreign leader in her day. When you would ask or were asked who was the most admired leader, it was always Margaret Thatcher. I had the privilege of sitting next to her at a small dinner in London several years ago when she had then retired as Prime Minister, and she, I must say, is an extraordinary woman. She was very, very forceful and very arrogant, and I remember asking her, what would you suggest doing in Russia? They've got a real problem over there. She said, I would send British judges and teach them English law. I mean, that was, yes, Maggie, that was it. But anyhow, our prayers go out to those who grieve over her passing, but she's been suffering dementia for several years now, and she, I'm sure, passed on quietly, but left a great legacy for people to follow. Lee?
5 Christians are dead after weekend fighting in Egypt. A mob threw firebombs and rocks at a crowd of Christians outside Cairo's largest cathedral Sunday. One believer died in that attack. The crowd was protesting the deaths of 4 other Christians in sectarian violence over the weekend. They gathered outside St. Mark's Coptic Orthodox Cathedral after the funeral. Christians are angry that the new government in Egypt isn't doing enough to protect them from Muslim attacks. Israelis paused to remember the Holocaust today. For 2 minutes, traffic stopped and Israelis paused to reflect on the horrors inflicted on the Jewish people during World War II. Secretary of State John Kerry joined Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and laid a wreath in memory of those who died. Israeli President Shimon Peres said the threat of the Holocaust against one nation is a threat against all nations. And Netanyahu made a reference to Iran when he said the threats to Jews remain.
The murderous hatred against the Jews that has accompanied the history of our people has not disappeared.
There are less than 200,000 Holocaust survivors left in Israel, and that's why some worry the memory and the impact of the Holocaust could fade. The White House is making the case for President Obama's budget, that plan calling for more new taxes, but Republicans say they will not go along with another tax hike after the one at the beginning of the year. The plan also includes new spending for education and public works projects, but some Democrats do not like the cuts in Social Security and other benefit programs. Pat?
Well, it's amazing. It doesn't seem the president can garner support in his own party for anything. But, Lee, the thing that worries me, it's always class warfare. There was a proposal that's been bruited by the White House to begin to tax IRAs, to invade the retirement accounts of seniors. And the thought was that nobody needed more than $200,000 a year in income in order to live, and that those accounts should be reduced to a point where they would be earning that amount. This is socialism in its worst form, and yet this is the mindset. So we're not looking at something that will raise revenue. We're not looking at something that will truly balance the budget and bring about fiscal stability. What we're looking about is so-called tax fairness, which means punishing those who are achievers in order to give it to those who are not so fortunate. And that just isn't what the government is intended to do. Lee?
Pat, a new study shows an ingredient in energy drinks and red meat may increase the risk of heart disease. That ingredient is called carnitine. Researchers at the Cleveland Clinic warn it could be clogging arteries of those who consume it.
Carnitine is, I think, a cause for concern because our data really suggests that this is a risk factor for accelerated heart disease.
Carnitine is a popular ingredient in some energy drinks because it may help convert fat into energy. Interesting, Pat.
I tell you, if these researchers have their way, we won't eat anything.
Well, carnitine used to be on your list of good stuff, didn't it?
It's good stuff. I take acetyl L-carnitine as one of the finest things for your memory, for your circulation. Now that is a different kind of, it's a type of carnitine, but the word carne, you know, is Latin for, is it Latin, Greek, whatever, for meat, carne. And so it's a derivative of meat. I must say, though, Terry, today, your old vegetarian friend, I had walnuts and almonds and oat bran and oatmeal.
The stuff that's unquestionably good.
But I'm not sure the Cleveland Clinic will pass that. Before long, Johns Hopkins or somebody will come up with a study and say, this is bad for you. It's getting so you can't eat anything.
U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder is being called one of America's top facilitators of pornography. The group Morality and Media has created a so-called Dirty Dozen list of the top porn problem makers. They say Attorney General Holder has taken actions that have allowed the porn industry to thrive. Other offenders include Google's App Store, the American Library Association, and Facebook. The goal of this list is to bring awareness to the harm caused by America's porn pandemic. The group believes it's led to violence against women, increased child pornography, and sex trafficking. CBN is working to help refugees after a fire destroyed their camp in western Thailand. More than 2,000 people were left homeless by the blaze. Many of those are Christian refugees from Burma. CBN partnered with local churches to help reach out to the victims of this fire, offering clothes, shoes, and cooking supplies. A church was also destroyed in that fire. CBN is planning to provide tents for worshipers until it can be rebuilt. Many of the refugees say that despite the fire, God has given them hope. You can find out more about what CBN is doing around the world by logging on to cbn.com/international.